You're about to hear a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about safety, trust, and survival. What if I told you a man vanished from a luxury cruise ship, leaving no trace behind, and was found floating in the middle of the ocean 2 years later? I know what you're thinking. That's impossible. People don't just disappear from cruise ships and turn up alive after 2 years adrift at sea. But this happened, and the truth behind what happened to John Mitchell is far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Before we dive into this story, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another missing person case. This isn't just another tragedy that happened to someone else, somewhere far away. This is a story that could happen to anyone, to you, to someone you love. And by the time we reach the end of this journey together, you'll have learned something that could save a life, something that could protect the people you care about most. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. Miami, Florida, March 15th, 2019. The sun was shining, the ocean sparkled like diamonds scattered across an endless blue canvas. The port of Miami was alive with excitement as thousands of passengers prepared to board the Caribbean Dream, one of the most luxurious cruise ships in the world. Among those passengers was a man named John Mitchell. John was 42 years old. He had sandy brown hair that was just starting to gray at the temples, laugh lines around his eyes from a life well lived, and a smile that could light up a room. He was the kind of man people naturally gravitated toward, warm, friendly, always ready with a joke or a helping hand. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Atlanta, Georgia. Not the most exciting job in the world, but it paid the bills and gave him the stability he needed to provide for his family. That's what mattered most to John. His wife, Sarah, was his high school sweetheart. They'd been married for 18 years. She had auburn hair that fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a quiet strength that John had always admired. They had two children. Emma was 15, bright, ambitious, already talking about which colleges she wanted to apply to. And little Michael was 10, obsessed with dinosaurs and video games. Still young enough to think his dad was the coolest person in the world. John loved his family more than anything. He worked hard to give them a good life, even if it meant putting in long hours at the office and missing the occasional soccer game or school recital. This cruise was supposed to be different. This was going to be their time together. Just the two of them. No kids, no work, no distractions. Sarah had been planning this trip for months. She'd saved up, researched the best excursions, picked out the perfect cabin with a balcony overlooking the ocean. This was going to be their second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect, to remember why they fell in love in the first place. John was excited, really excited. He'd been talking about it for weeks, counting down the days until they could finally escape the routine of everyday life. The morning they left, John woke up early. He made Sarah breakfast in bed, scrambled eggs, toast, fresh orange juice. It was a small gesture, but it was his way of saying thank you. Thank you for being patient with him. Thank you for understanding when work took over. Thank you for never giving up on them. They drove to the port together, windows down, music playing, both of them grinning like teenagers on their first date. When they arrived and saw the Caribbean Dream for the first time, Sarah gasped. The ship was massive, 16 decks, multiple pools, restaurants, theaters, even a rock climbing wall and a zip line. It was like a floating city, capable of carrying over 4,000 passengers and a crew of more than 1,500. John grabbed their suitcases from the trunk. Sarah took his hand. "This is going to be perfect," she said. John squeezed her hand and smiled. "I love you. I love you too." They boarded the ship around noon. The Caribbean Dream was scheduled to depart at 4 in the afternoon, heading toward the Bahamas, then Jamaica, then the Cayman Islands before returning to Miami 7 days later. 7 days of paradise. 7 days of no responsibilities, no stress, no worries. Or so they thought. Their cabin was on deck 9. It was beautiful, modern, spacious, with a king-size bed, a small sitting area, and sliding glass doors that opened onto a private balcony. The view was breathtaking. You could see the entire port, the Miami skyline in the distance, the endless expanse of ocean stretching out toward the horizon. Sarah immediately started unpacking, hanging up clothes, organizing their toiletries. John laughed and told her to relax. They had a whole week to get settled. But that was Sarah, always planning, always making sure everything was just right. John stepped out onto the balcony and leaned against the railing. The metal was warm from the sun. The breeze smelled like salt and freedom. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was exactly what he needed. At 4 o'clock sharp, the ship's horn blasted, a deep, resonant sound that echoed across the water. The Caribbean dream began to pull away from the dock, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it headed out into open water. John and Sarah stood on their balcony and watched Miami disappear behind them. The buildings got smaller and smaller until they were just tiny specks on the horizon. Then they were gone completely. Nothing but ocean now. Endless, beautiful ocean. That first night, everything was perfect. They had dinner at one of the ship's upscale restaurants, a 5-course meal with wine pairings, impeccable service, the kind of experience they could never afford on a regular Tuesday night back home. After dinner, they walked around the ship, exploring. They found a piano bar where a talented musician played old jazz standards. They found a nightclub where younger passengers danced under neon lights. They found a quiet deck at the back of the ship where they could stand together under the stars. The sky was incredible. No city lights to drown out the stars. Just thousands upon thousands of tiny points of light scattered across the darkness. Sarah rested her head on John's shoulder. "I'm so glad we're doing this." John kissed the top of her head. "Me too." They went to bed late that night, happy and exhausted. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately, curled up against John's chest. John stayed awake a little longer, listening to the gentle hum of the ship's engines, the soft rhythm of Sarah's breathing. He felt peaceful, content, like everything in his life had finally aligned the way it was supposed to. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. He had no idea that this perfect vacation was about to turn into a nightmare. He had no idea that he was about to disappear. The next morning, March 16th, 2009, John woke up around 7. Sarah was still asleep. He decided to let her rest and slipped quietly out of bed. He pulled on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, grabbed his room key, and headed out to grab some coffee. The ship was already awake. Crew members were cleaning the decks, setting up lounge chairs, preparing for the day ahead. A few early rising passengers were already at the breakfast buffet, loading up plates with eggs and bacon and pastries. John poured himself a cup of coffee from one of the self-service stations on deck 11. He took it black, no sugar, no cream. He liked the bitter taste, the way it jolted him awake. He found a quiet spot near the railing and stood there, sipping his coffee and watching the ocean. It was calm that morning. The water was a deep, dark blue, almost black in some places. The ship cut through it effortlessly, leaving a white trail of foam in its wake. John checked his watch. 7:30. Sarah would probably wake up soon. Maybe they'd grab breakfast together, then spend the morning by the pool. Or maybe they'd just stay in bed a little longer. They had no schedule, no plans. That was the beauty of it. He finished his coffee and headed back toward the cabin. He never made it. When Sarah woke up around 9, John was gone. At first, she didn't think anything of it. She assumed he'd gone for a walk or grabbed breakfast without her. She took her time getting ready, showered, put on a sundress, did her makeup. By 10 o'clock, John still wasn't back. She sent him a text. "Where are you?" No response. She tried calling. It went straight to voicemail. Now she was starting to get worried. Sarah left the cabin and started searching. She checked the breakfast buffet, the pool deck, the gym, the coffee stations. She asked crew members if they'd seen a man matching John's description. Nobody had. By 11, panic was starting to set in. She went to guest services on deck 5 and told them her husband was missing. The woman at the desk, a young crew member with a name tag that read Maria, smiled politely and said not to worry. People wander off all the time on cruise ships. He probably just lost track of time. But Sarah knew John. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't just disappear without telling her. By noon, the ship's security team was involved. They pulled up the records for John's room key. The last time it had been used was when he left the cabin at 7:04 that morning. They checked the surveillance cameras. They saw John getting coffee on deck 11 at 7:22. They saw him standing by the railing. They saw him finishing his coffee and walking toward the stairs. And then nothing. He just vanished. No footage of him going back to the cabin. No footage of him anywhere else on the ship. It was like he'd been erased. The ship's captain, a stern, gray-haired man named Captain Reynolds, made the decision to conduct a full search of the vessel. Crew members fanned out across all 16 decks. They checked every restaurant, every bar, every theater, every hallway. They checked storage rooms and utility closets. They checked areas that were supposed to be off limits to passengers. They found nothing. No sign of John Mitchell anywhere. By 2 in the afternoon, Captain Reynolds had to consider the worst-case scenario. Man overboard. It's the nightmare every cruise line tries to avoid. The statistics are grim. If someone falls off a cruise ship into the open ocean, the chances of survival are extremely low. The ship is moving fast, 20 to 25 knots. By the time anyone realizes someone is missing, the ship could be miles away from where the person went into the water. And even if they turn the ship around and search, the ocean is vast. The currents are strong. A human body is tiny compared to the endless expanse of water. Most people who fall overboard are never found. Captain Reynolds ordered the ship to stop and reverse course. They began a systematic search of the area where John was last seen on camera. Sarah stood on the deck, gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. She watched as crew members scanned the water with binoculars. She watched as spotlights swept across the waves. She watched and prayed and begged whatever gods might be listening to bring her husband back. The search continued for hours. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But Sarah couldn't see the beauty. All she could see was the endless, empty ocean. As darkness fell, Captain Reynolds made the heartbreaking decision to call off the search. The United States Coast Guard had been notified. They would continue searching the area, but the Caribbean dream had a schedule to keep. Thousands of passengers were waiting to reach the next port. The ship had to move on. Sarah refused to leave the deck. She stood there alone in the dark, staring out at the water. Somewhere out there was her husband, the man she'd loved since she was 17 years old, the father of her children, her best friend. Was he still alive? Was he treading water, waiting for someone to find him? Was he calling out for help that would never come? Or was he already gone? The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. They used helicopters, boats, advanced sonar equipment. They covered hundreds of square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No body, no debris, no evidence that John Mitchell had ever been there at all. On March 19, 2019, the search was officially called off. John Mitchell was declared missing at sea, presumed dead. Sarah returned home to Atlanta alone. She had to tell her children that their father wasn't coming back. She had to plan a memorial service for a man whose body would never be recovered. She had to somehow figure out how to keep living when half of her heart was gone. Emma stopped talking about college. She became quiet, withdrawn. She spent most of her time in her room, crying when she thought no one could hear. Michael didn't understand. He kept asking when Daddy was coming home. He kept waiting by the door, convinced that any minute now, John would walk through it with that big smile and scoop him up in his arms. Sarah didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his father is never coming back? How do you make him understand that sometimes people just disappear and there's nothing you can do about it? The cruise line issued a statement expressing their deepest condolences. They conducted an internal investigation and concluded that John must have accidentally fallen overboard. They never found any evidence of foul play. No witnesses who saw anything suspicious. No signs of a struggle. It was ruled an accident. A tragic, heartbreaking accident. The case was closed. But Sarah couldn't accept that. She knew John. He wasn't careless. He wouldn't have just leaned too far over a railing and fallen. He was cautious, responsible. He wouldn't have put himself in danger. Something else had happened. Something the cruise line didn't want to talk about. Something they were covering up. But she had no proof, no evidence. Nothing but a gut feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Sarah tried to move on. She went back to work. She helped the kids with their homework. She paid the bills. She kept the house running. But she was just going through the motions. Inside, she was broken. At night, she would lie in bed and stare at the empty space beside her. John's pillow still smelled like him. His cologne, his shampoo, that distinct scent that was uniquely his. She couldn't bring herself to wash it. She couldn't let go of that last little piece of him. Emma graduated from high school in 2020. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it was a reminder of everything they'd lost. Sarah took pictures of Emma in her cap and gown, standing in front of the house, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was an empty chair at the graduation ceremony. Sarah had brought a framed photo of John and placed it on the seat beside her, too. When Emma's name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Sarah clapped and cheered and cried. John should have been there. He should have been standing on his feet, shouting louder than anyone else, so proud of his little girl. But he wasn't there. He was gone. 2 years passed. 2 long, painful years of grief and unanswered questions and endless what-ifs. Sarah had started seeing a therapist. It helped, a little. She was learning to cope with the loss, to build a life without John in it. The kids were doing better too. Emma was thriving at college, studying pre-med. Michael was 12 now, taller, more mature. He still missed his dad, but the constant crying had stopped. They were healing, slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. And then, on March 10th, 2021, Sarah got a phone call that changed everything. It was from the Coast Guard. A fishing vessel had found a man floating in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 800 miles east of Miami. He was barely alive, dehydrated, suffering from severe malnutrition and exposure. He'd been clinging to a makeshift raft, pieces of wood lashed together with what looked like rope made from twisted cloth. When the fisherman pulled him aboard, he could barely speak. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His skin was burned and peeling from constant sun exposure. He'd lost at least 50 pounds, but he was alive. And he'd told them his name, John Mitchell. Sarah's phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the kitchen floor. She stood there frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to process what she'd just heard. John, her John, he was alive. After 2 years, after being declared dead, after she'd buried her grief and learned to live without him. He was alive. The next few hours were a blur. Sarah called her parents, called John's parents, called everyone who needed to know. She booked a flight to the Coast Guard station in Florida where John was being treated. She barely remembered packing a bag or driving to the airport. All she could think about was seeing him again, holding him, telling him how much she loved him, how much she'd missed him, how many times she'd prayed for a miracle just like this. When she arrived at the medical facility, a doctor met her in the hallway. His name was Dr. Patel. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He told Sarah that John's physical condition was serious but stable. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished. He had infections and several wounds. His body had been through unimaginable trauma, but he was going to survive. Sarah started crying, relief, disbelief. It all came pouring out of her in great, heaving sobs. Patel put a hand on her shoulder. There's something else you need to know. Sarah looked up, wiping her eyes. What? His memory, Dr. Patel said slowly. It's fragmented. He remembers some things, but there are significant gaps. He's confused, disoriented. He can't tell us exactly what happened to him over the past 2 years. Sarah didn't care. She didn't care if he couldn't remember. She didn't care if he was confused. He was alive. That was all that mattered. Can I see him, she asked. Dr. Patel nodded. Follow me. They walked down a long, sterile hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Dr. Patel stopped in front of a door. He's in here. Take as much time as you need. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She took a deep breath and pushed it open. The man lying in the hospital bed didn't look like John. He was gaunt, almost skeletal. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were sunken. His hair had grown long and matted. His skin was covered in scars and burns and cuts in various stages of healing. But when he turned his head and looked at her, she saw him. Her John. Those same brown eyes that had looked at her with so much love on their wedding day, the day Emma was born, The day Michael took his first steps, those eyes filled with tears. "Sarah," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Sarah crossed the room in 3 strides. She reached for him carefully, afraid he might break. He grabbed her hand and held on like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "I'm here," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here. You're safe now. You're home." They held each other and cried. For a long time, they didn't speak. There were no words that could capture the enormity of what they were feeling. Relief, grief, joy, confusion, fear, hope, all of it tangled together into something indescribable. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah studied his face. "What happened to you, Guan?" she asked softly. John shook his head. I don't, I don't know. I can't remember." "What do you mean you can't remember?" It's all pieces, fragments, like a dream I can't quite hold on to." He closed his eyes. "I remember being on the ship. I remember getting coffee, and then—" He trailed off, his face twisting in frustration. "And then what?" Sarah pressed gently. "Darkness," John said. "Just darkness. And pain. And water. So much water." Over the next several days, Sarah stayed by John's side as he slowly regained his strength. The doctors ran test after test. They treated his infections, rehydrated him, started him on a carefully monitored nutrition plan to help him regain the weight he'd lost. But the memory issues persisted. John could remember his life before the cruise. He remembered Sarah, the kids, his job, their house. He remembered boarding the Caribbean Dream. But everything after that was a blur. He had flashes, brief, disjointed images that didn't make sense. He remembered being in the water. He remembered building the raft. He remembered days and nights bleeding together into an endless stretch of suffering. But he couldn't remember how he'd ended up in the ocean. He couldn't remember if anyone had been with him. He couldn't remember how he'd survived for 2 years. The story made national news. Man missing at sea for 2 years, found alive. Reporters swarmed the hospital. They wanted interviews, photos, details. Sarah refused to let them anywhere near John. The cruise line issued another statement. They were thrilled that John had been found alive. They would be conducting a full investigation to determine what had happened. But privately, Sarah could tell they were panicking. A man doesn't just disappear from a cruise ship and turn up alive 2 years later, floating in the middle of the ocean. That doesn't happen by accident. Something had gone terribly wrong on that ship, and they knew it. As John's physical health improved, the authorities got involved. FBI agents came to interview him, Coast Guard investigators, representatives from the cruise line. They all asked the same questions. What happened on the ship? Did you fall overboard? Was there anyone with you? Did someone push you? John's answers were always the same. "I don't know. I don't remember. It was frustrating for everyone." But Sarah could see how much it was tearing John apart. He wanted to remember. He wanted to understand what had happened to him. But every time he tried to reach for those memories, they slipped away like smoke. One night, about a week after he'd been found, John woke up screaming. Sarah, who'd been sleeping in a chair beside his bed, jumped up. "John, John, it's okay. You're safe." But he wasn't hearing her. He was thrashing in the bed, his eyes wide with terror. "No," he shouted. "No, please don't." Sarah grabbed his shoulders. "John, look at me. You're safe." His eyes finally focused on her. He was breathing hard, drenched in sweat. "It was just a dream," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "You're okay." John shook his head. "It wasn't a dream." "What do you mean?" "I remembered something," he said. His voice was shaking. "Sarah, I remembered." Sarah pulled up the chair and sat down close to the bed. "Tell me." John closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the memory before it slipped away again. "I was on the deck," he said slowly. "Deck 11. I just finished my coffee. I was going to head back to the cabin." "Okay, and then what?" Someone was there. A man. I didn't recognize him. He asked if I could help him with something." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who was he?" "I don't know. I'd never seen him before. But he seemed friendly, normal. So I said yes." What did he want? John's hands were clenching the sheets. He said something was wrong with one of the lifeboats. He needed someone to help him check it. I thought it was strange, but he was a crew member. He had the uniform. I didn't think. He stopped, his breathing getting faster. John, Sarah said gently, what happened? We walked to the back of the ship. There was a maintenance area, somewhere passengers weren't supposed to be. I remember thinking I should probably turn back, but he kept talking, kept walking, and I just followed him. Sarah felt sick. She knew where this was going. And then what? She whispered. John opened his eyes. They were filled with a pain so deep it was almost unbearable to look at. And then everything went black. The next morning, Sarah called the FBI. She told them about John's dream or memory or whatever it was. She told them about the crew member, the maintenance area, the fact that John had been led somewhere he shouldn't have been. The agents listened carefully and promised to investigate. But Sarah could hear the skepticism in their voices. John's memories were fragmented. He'd been through severe trauma. Dreams and reality were probably getting mixed up in his mind. They would look into it, they said, but she shouldn't get her hopes up. Sarah refused to accept that. She started her own investigation. She requested the passenger manifest from the Caribbean Dream for March 16, 2019. She pored over every name, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to harm John. She requested crew records, background checks, employment histories. She spent hours on the phone with the cruise line, with lawyers, with anyone who might have information. Most people brushed her off, told her to let the authorities handle it, told her to focus on taking care of John instead of chasing conspiracy theories. But Sarah wouldn't stop, because she knew. Deep in her gut, she knew. John hadn't accidentally fallen overboard. Someone had done this to him, and she was going to find out who. While Sarah was digging into the records, John was struggling with his own demons. The memories were coming back, slowly in pieces like a shattered mirror being put back together. But each memory brought new pain. He remembered the cold, the endless, bone-deep cold of the ocean at night. He remembered the thirst, the way his throat felt like it was full of glass, the way his lips cracked and bled. He remembered the sun, the relentless, burning sun that cooked his skin during the day. He remembered the loneliness, the terrifying, all-consuming loneliness of being utterly alone in the middle of the ocean with no hope of rescue. But there were other memories too, darker ones. He remembered voices, arguments, hands on him, pushing, shoving. He remembered falling, the sensation of tumbling through the air, arms flailing, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. He remembered hitting the water, the shock of it, the way it felt like being punched by a giant fist. He remembered going under, the water closing over his head, the panic, the burning in his lungs as he fought to swim back to the surface. And then there were the memories that didn't make sense. He remembered being on some kind of boat, not the cruise ship, something smaller. He remembered other people, faces he didn't recognize, voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. He remembered being held somewhere, a room with concrete walls and no windows. He remembered pain, so much pain. Were these memories real, or were they nightmares created by a traumatized mind trying to make sense of something incomprehensible? John didn't know, and that uncertainty was eating him alive. 3 weeks after John was found, Sarah finally got a breakthrough. She'd been going through the crew records from the Caribbean Dream when she found something strange. A crew member named Miguel Santos had been listed as working on the ship on March 16, 2019. He'd been part of the maintenance staff. But 2 days after John disappeared, Miguel Santos had quit. He'd given no notice. Just walked off the ship at the next port and never came back. The cruise line had flagged it as unusual, but they hadn't followed up. Crew members quit all the time. It wasn't worth investigating. But Sarah knew better. She started digging into Miguel Santos' background. What she found made her blood run cold. Miguel Santos wasn't his real name. His real name was Diego Vargas. He'd been born in Colombia and had a criminal record a mile long. Assault, theft, drug trafficking. He'd been working on cruise ships for years, moving from one line to another, always under different names. And in 2018, just 1 year before John disappeared, Diego Vargas had been investigated in connection with a human trafficking operation. The charges hadn't stuck. There wasn't enough evidence, but the investigators had been certain he was involved. Sarah felt like she was going to be sick. This man, this dangerous criminal, had been working on the same ship as her husband, had access to passengers, had been able to move freely throughout the ship without anyone questioning him. And 2 days after John vanished, he disappeared too. Sarah took everything she'd found to the FBI. This time they listened. They launched a full investigation into Diego Vargas. They tracked his movements after he'd left the Caribbean dream. What they discovered was horrifying. Diego Vargas was part of an organized crime network that operated throughout the Caribbean. They specialized in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and a dozen other illegal activities. And they'd been using cruise ships as cover for years. Crew members would identify potential targets, passengers traveling alone or who seemed vulnerable. They would lure them to isolated areas of the ship, and then they would make them disappear. Some victims were thrown overboard. Others were smuggled off the ship at ports and sold into slavery. It was a sophisticated operation that had been going on for at least a decade, and John had stumbled right into the middle of it. The FBI arrested Diego Vargas in July 2021. He was living in a small coastal town in Mexico, working at a resort under yet another fake name. When they searched his apartment, they found evidence linking him to dozens of disappearances. Photos, IDs, personal belongings taken from victims. Among them was John's wallet, the same wallet he'd had in his pocket when he boarded the Caribbean Dream 2 years earlier. Diego Vargas was extradited to the United States and charged with kidnapping, human trafficking, and attempted murder. During interrogation, he finally confessed. Yes, he'd been the one who approached John on deck 11. Yes, he'd led him to the maintenance area under the pretense of checking a lifeboat. Yes, he'd attacked John from behind and thrown him overboard. But he insisted he'd been following orders. He was just a low-level player in a much larger organization. The FBI pressed him for names. Who was running the operation? Who had ordered him to target John specifically? Diego Vargas refused to talk. He knew what happened to people who talked. He'd seen it happen before. Bodies found in ditches, families wiped out overnight. So he kept his mouth shut and took a plea deal, 40 years in federal prison. But Sarah wasn't satisfied. Diego Vargas had confessed to throwing John overboard. That explained how John ended up in the ocean, but it didn't explain how he'd survived. It didn't explain the 2 years he'd spent floating on a makeshift raft. It didn't explain the memories of being held in a concrete room, of being on a smaller boat, of voices speaking in foreign languages. There was more to this story, and Sarah was determined to find out what. She went back to visit John, who was still recovering in a long-term care facility. His physical health had improved dramatically. He'd gained back most of the weight he'd lost. The infections had cleared up. The scars were fading, but the psychological damage was much harder to heal. He had nightmares almost every night, panic attacks, flashbacks to his time in the ocean. He was seeing a therapist 3 times a week, but progress was slow. Sarah sat down beside his bed and took his hand. "They arrested the man who threw you overboard," she said. John looked at her. "I know, the FBI told me. His name is Diego Vargas. He confessed to everything." John nodded slowly. He didn't seem surprised or relieved, just tired. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said carefully. "And I need you to try to remember, okay?" "Okay. After you hit the water, after Diego threw you off the ship, what happened next?" John closed his eyes. He was quiet for a long time. Sarah waited. She'd learned not to push him. The memories came when they were ready, not before. Finally, John spoke. "I was in the water," he said. "I don't know how long, hours maybe. I tried to swim, but I didn't know which direction to go. Everything looked the same, just water. Endless water." He paused, his jaw clenching. "I thought I was going to die. I was so tired, so cold. I just wanted to let go and sink." Sarah squeezed his hand. "But then I saw lights," John continued. "A boat, a small fishing boat. I started screaming, waving my arms. I didn't think they'd see me, but they did. They pulled me out of the water." Sarah's heart was pounding. "Who were they?" I don't know. They didn't speak English. I think they were speaking Spanish or Portuguese maybe. I'm not sure. What did they do with you? John's face darkened. They tied me up, put me in the cargo hold. I tried to tell them I needed help, that I'd fallen off a cruise ship, but they didn't care. Or maybe they didn't understand. I don't know. Sarah felt sick. How long were you on that boat? Weeks, maybe a month. I lost track of time. They gave me just enough food and water to keep me alive, but nothing more. Why, Beike? Why would they do that? John looked at her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. Because they were going to sell me. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Sell him. They were going to sell him. Where? She finally managed to ask. Where were they taking you? I don't know, John said. Somewhere in South America, I think. I heard them talking about a port, a city, but I didn't understand the name. What happened? How did you escape? John shook his head. I didn't escape. Not exactly. Then what? There was a storm, John said. A bad one. The boat was small, old. It couldn't handle the waves. I was in the cargo hold when the boat started taking on water. I could hear the crew shouting, panicking. He swallowed hard. The boat capsized. I was underwater, still tied up. I thought that was it, that I was going to drown. How did you get free? The ropes. They were old, frayed. When the boat flipped, something sharp, metal, maybe, cut through them. I managed to get loose and swim to the surface. Sarah was crying now. She couldn't help it. I grabbed onto a piece of debris, John said. Part of the boat that had broken off. I held on for hours. By the time the storm passed, there was no sign of the boat or the crew. Just me and pieces of wreckage floating in the water. And that's when you built the raft? John nodded. I found wood, some rope, anything that would float. I tied it all together. It wasn't much, but it kept me out of the water. For 2 years, Sarah whispered. For 2 years, John repeated. The FBI reopened the investigation with this new information. They searched for reports of missing fishing vessels in the Caribbean around April 2019. They contacted authorities in South America, asking about human trafficking operations. They found dozens of cases, hundreds even. The illegal trade in human beings was a multi-billion-dollar industry. People disappeared all the time, snatched from streets, beaches, ships, sold to whoever was willing to pay. Most were never found. John had been incredibly, impossibly lucky. Or maybe lucky wasn't the right word. He'd survived, but at what cost? Sarah brought the kids to see John a month later. Emma cried when she saw him. She'd been so angry for so long, angry at the world, angry at God, angry at her father for leaving them. But when she saw him lying in that hospital bed, all the anger melted away. Dad, she sobbed, throwing her arms around him. John held her and cried too. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Michael was more reserved. He hung back, uncertain. This man looked like his father, sounded like his father, but 2 years was a long time for a kid. The memories had faded, John noticed. He smiled gently. Hey, buddy, he said. Michael took a tentative step forward. Hi. You've gotten so big. I bet you're taller than your sister now. Michael shook his head. Not yet, but maybe soon. John held out his hand. Come here. Michael walked over slowly. John pulled him into a hug. I missed you, John whispered. Every single day I thought about you and your sister and your mom. That's what kept me alive. Michael started crying then. Great, heaving sobs that shook his whole body. I thought you were dead, he said. Everyone said you were dead. I know, but I'm here now. I'm right here. The FBI's investigation eventually stalled. They couldn't find the fishing boat. They couldn't identify the crew. They couldn't prove that John had been intended for human trafficking. Though all the evidence pointed to it, Diego Vargas was in prison. That was something. But the larger organization remained intact. The cruise line settled with Sarah and John out of court for an undisclosed amount. Part of the settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, but Sarah didn't care about the money. She cared about keeping other families from going through what hers had gone through. She started speaking out about the lack of security on cruise ships, about how easy it was for criminals to infiltrate crews, about how many people disappeared from cruise ship issues almost every year without explanation. She became an advocate for better regulations, better oversight, better protection for her passengers. It wouldn't bring back the 2 years John had lost. It wouldn't erase the trauma. But maybe it would save someone else. John was released from the care facility in October 2021. He came home to a house that felt both familiar and foreign. Everything was the same. Same furniture, same photos on the walls, same smell of Sarah's lavender candles. But everything was different too. He was different, Ed. The man who'd boarded the Caribbean Dream in March 2018 was gone. That version of John, the one who laughed easily, who took his family for granted, who thought the world was fundamentally safe, had died in the Atlantic Ocean. The man who came home was someone else, someone harder, someone haunted. He tried to go back to work. His old firm welcomed him with open arms, told him to take all the time he needed, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't sit in a cubicle and crunch numbers like nothing had happened. He couldn't make small talk with coworkers about their weekends when he'd spent 2 years floating in the ocean, waiting to die. After 3 weeks, he quit. Sarah was worried. She watched him withdraw into himself. He stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, spent most of his days sitting on the back porch, staring at nothing. At night, the nightmares came. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced he was still on the raft, still dying of thirst under the merciless sun. Sarah would hold him and remind him where he was. You're home, you're safe, it's over. But it wasn't over, not really. How do you move on from something like that? How do you rebuild a life when the foundation has been shattered? The therapist said it would take time, years probably, maybe a lifetime. Post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, dissociation, depression. John had all of it, but he was trying. That's what mattered. He started going to a support group for people who'd survived kidnapping and trafficking. It helped to talk to others who understood, who'd been through similar hells. He started writing, just fragments at first. Memories and feelings he couldn't express out loud. But slowly the fragments became paragraphs. The paragraphs became pages. His therapist encouraged it. Writing could be therapeutic, a way to process trauma. John didn't know if it was helping, but it gave him something to do, a purpose. 6 months after he came home, John and Sarah renewed their vows. It wasn't a big ceremony, just close family and friends in their backyard. Sarah wore a simple white dress. John wore a suit that hung a little loose on his still recovering frame. They stood under an arch of flowers and said the same words they'd said 18 years ago. But this time they understood the weight of those words, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. They'd lived through the worst. They'd survived the sickness, and they were still here, still together, still fighting. Emma gave a speech at the reception. She talked about what it was like to lose her father and then get him back. I don't think I understood how fragile life is until Dad disappeared, she said. You assume the people you love will always be there, that you'll have more time, more chances to say the things you want to say. She looked at John, tears streaming down her face. But sometimes you don't get that time. Sometimes people are just gone and you never get to say goodbye. Her voice broke. So I'm grateful. I'm so grateful that we got a second chance, that Dad came home. I know not everyone is that lucky. Michael stood up and hugged his sister. Then he turned to John. I'm glad you're home, Dad. John smiled. Me too, buddy. Me too. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. Emma went back to college. Michael started 80th grade. Sarah returned to her job as a teacher. John still struggled, but he was learning to live with it. The nightmares came less frequently. The panic attacks were more manageable. He'd started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that helped trafficking survivors. He figured if he couldn't save himself, maybe he could help save someone else. It gave him purpose, a reason to keep going. And then, in January 2022, something happened that changed everything. John was at home, sorting through some old boxes in the garage, when he found something he'd forgotten about. His phone. The phone he'd had with him on the cruise. The phone that had been declared lost when he disappeared. But it wasn't lost. It was here, tucked into a jacket pocket in a box of clothes Sarah had packed away. John stared at it for a long moment. Then, on impulse, he plugged it in. The battery was completely dead, of course. He waited for it to charge, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. When the screen finally lit up, he unlocked it. And there, in his photo gallery, was something that made his blood run cold. A photo, taken on the morning of March 16th, 2020. A selfie of John standing on deck 11, coffee in hand, smiling at the camera. But he wasn't alone in the photo. In the background, partially obscured by a pillar, was a man in a crew uniform, a man who was staring directly at John with an expression that could only be described as predatory. John zoomed in on the face. It was Diego Vargas. John's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. He'd taken this photo just minutes before he disappeared. He didn't even remember taking it. Must have been one of those random selfies you take and forget about. But here it was, proof. Proof that Diego Vargas had been watching him, stalking him, waiting for the right moment to strike. John immediately called the FBI. They came to the house and took the phone as evidence. They analyzed the photo, verified its authenticity. It was real, and it opened up a whole new line of investigation. If Diego Vargas had been watching John before the attack, that meant the assault wasn't random. It was planned, targeted. But why? Why John specifically? He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he wasn't anyone special. The FBI dug deeper, and what they found was chilling. The human trafficking network that Diego worked for didn't just grab random people off cruise ships. They had a system, a method. They looked for specific types of people. Middle-aged men traveling with their ways, people who seemed happy, stable, healthy, people who wouldn't be missed right away because everyone would assume they just wandered off. And they preferred people with no major ties to their departure city, people who were just passing through. John fit the profile perfectly. He and Sarah were from Atlanta. The cruise departed from Miami. They didn't know anyone in Florida. They were just tourists, easy targets. But there was more. The FBI discovered that the trafficking network had contacts inside the cruise line. People who had access to passenger manifests, credit card information, personal details. They would identify potential targets before the cruise even began. Pass the information along to crew members like Diego Vargas. By the time John stepped onto the Caribbean Dream, his fate had already been sealed. This revelation horrified Sarah. "You mean they were planning this before we even boarded?" she asked the FBI agent who'd come to update them. "Yes, ma'am. We believe John was targeted at least a week before the cruise departed." Sarah felt like she was going to be sick. All those months she'd spent planning the trip, researching the best excursions, picking out the perfect cabin. She'd been so excited, so happy. She'd had no idea she was leading her husband into a trap. The FBI made more arrests. A booking agent who'd been passing passenger information to the trafficking network. A crew supervisor who'd been helping criminals get jobs on cruise ships under fake names. A port security officer who'd been looking the other way. The whole operation began to unravel. In total, more than 30 people were arrested. The trafficking network was dismantled. It was a huge victory for law enforcement. But it couldn't give John back the 2 years he'd lost. As the legal proceedings dragged on, John's memories continued to return. He remembered more about the fishing boat now, the faces of the crew members who'd pulled him from the water, the dark, cramped cargo hold where they'd kept him. He remembered the storm more vividly, too, the way the boat had tossed and bucked in the waves, the sound of wood splintering, the rush of water, and he remembered something else, something he'd blocked out before. There had been other people on that boat, other captives. He remembered hearing them in the darkness, crying, begging, speaking in languages he didn't understand. When the boat capsized, they'd all been trapped below deck. John had been the only one to get free, the only one to survive. That knowledge haunted him. He'd survived when others hadn't. He'd made it home when they never would. Why? What made him special? What gave him the right to live when they died? His therapist told him it wasn't about deserving it. Survival was often just luck. Being in the right place at the right time, having the ropes cut just enough to slip free. But that didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. John started having dreams about them, the other captives, faces he'd never seen, voices he'd only heard in the darkness. In the dreams, they would reach for him, beg him to save them. But he couldn't. He could only watch as they drowned. He would wake up gasping, Sarah's arms around him, reminding him it wasn't his fault. But it felt like his fault. Sarah suggested they go to therapy together, couples counseling. John agreed. They talked about the guilt, the anger, the fear, all the emotions they'd been carrying alone. The therapist helped them understand that they were both trauma survivors in different ways. John had survived the physical ordeal. Sarah had survived the emotional one. 2 years of not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. 2 years of raising their children alone. 2 years of grief. They'd both been through hell, and they needed to heal together. Slowly things got better. Not perfect, not even close to perfect, but better. John started sleeping more. The nightmares came less frequently. He started eating more. The weight came back. He started to look like himself again. He started smiling more, laughing occasionally, finding small moments of joy in everyday life. It was a long road, with setbacks and bad days and moments when it felt like the darkness would swallow him whole. But he kept going for Sarah, for the kids, for himself. In March 2023, 4 years after he'd disappeared, John did something he thought he'd never do. He went back to the ocean. Not on a cruise ship. He wasn't ready for that. Maybe he'd never be ready for that. But Sarah rented a beach house for a week. Just the four of them. A family vacation. John was terrified. The thought of being near the ocean made his chest tight, his breathing shallow. But Sarah held his hand and reminded him that he didn't have to do anything he didn't want to do. They could stay in Taiwan. They could go home early, whatever he needed. John took a deep breath and walked down to the beach. It was early morning. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The ocean was calm, small waves lapping gently at the shore. John stood at the edge of the water and stared out at the horizon. This ocean had tried to kill him. It had taken 2 years of his life. It had broken him in ways he was still trying to understand. But it hadn't won. He was still here, still standing, still alive. He felt Sarah's hand slip into his. "You okay?" she asked softly. John nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Emma and Michael joined them, standing on either side of their parents. They stood together in silence, watching the sun rise over the water. And for the first time in a long time, John felt something other than fear. He felt peace. Now, before we wrap up this story, I want to talk about something important, something that could save your life, or the life of someone you love. Because what happened to John wasn't inevitable. It wasn't unavoidable. There were warning signs, red flags, moments when things could have gone differently. And I want to make sure you know what to look for, so you can protect yourself, so you can protect your family. Here are 5 crucial lessons from John's story. 5 things you need to know to stay safe. Lesson number 5, trust your instincts. John remembered that moment when Diego Vargas asked him to help check the lifeboat. He remembered thinking it was strange. A crew member asking a passenger for help? That's not normal protocol. John felt that something was off, but he ignored it. He didn't want to be rude, didn't want to seem paranoid. So he followed Diego to the maintenance area even though his gut was screaming at him not to. That decision almost cost him his life. Your instincts exist for a reason. They're your brain's way of recognizing danger even when you can't consciously identify what's wrong. If something feels off, even if you can't explain why, listen to that feeling. Don't worry about being polite. Don't worry about seeming suspicious or paranoid. Your safety is more important than social niceties. If a crew member asks you to go somewhere isolated on a cruise ship, decline politely and report it to security. If someone approaches you with a request that seems unusual, take a moment to think about it before agreeing. If you feel uncomfortable in any situation, remove yourself immediately. Trust your gut. It might just save your life. Lesson number 4, Stay aware of your surroundings. John wasn't paying attention that morning on deck 11. He was distracted, thinking about breakfast, about the day ahead. He didn't notice Diego Vargas watching him, didn't notice that he was being followed. When you're on vacation, it's easy to let your guard down. You're relaxed, you're having fun, you're not thinking about danger, but predators count on that. They look for people who are distracted, people who aren't paying attention, people who are easy targets. Make a habit of staying aware. Notice who's around you. Notice if someone seems to be watching you or following you. Pay attention to your environment. Know where the exits are. Know where security stations are located. If you're on a cruise ship, familiarize yourself with the layout. Know how to get back to your cabin from anywhere on the ship. Don't walk around with your headphones in, completely absorbed in your phone. Keep your head up and your eyes open. Awareness doesn't mean living in fear. It just means being smart, being conscious of your environment. That awareness could give you the few extra seconds you need to recognize danger and get away from it. Lesson number 3, never go anywhere alone with a stranger. This seems obvious, right? Don't go off alone with people you don't know, but it happens all the time, especially in situations where the stranger has some kind of authority, a crew member in a uniform, a security guard, someone who seems official. We're conditioned to trust authority figures, to do what they say without questioning. But wearing a uniform doesn't automatically make someone trustworthy. If anyone, crew member or otherwise, asks you to go somewhere isolated, don't go alone. Bring a friend, bring your spouse, bring anyone. Or better yet, suggest meeting in a public area instead. If they insist on going somewhere private and won't explain why in a public space, that's a red flag. Report it to security immediately. Legitimate crew members won't have a problem with you bringing someone else along or meeting in a more public area. Only people with bad intentions will insist on getting you alone. Remember that. Lesson number 2, share your plans with someone you trust. When John left the cabin that morning to get coffee, Sarah was asleep. He didn't wake her up, didn't tell her where he was going. He thought he'd only be gone a few minutes. But those few minutes turned into 2 years. If Sarah had known where John was going, if they'd made a plan to meet up at a specific time, she would have known something was wrong much sooner. The ship's crew could have started searching immediately instead of hours later. It might not have changed the outcome, but it might have. Always share your plans with someone, your spouse, your travel companion, a friend back home. Let them know where you're going, what you're doing, and when you expect to be back. Check in regularly, a quick text, a phone call, just to let them know you're okay. If something happens, if you don't check in when you're supposed to, that person will know to raise the alarm immediately. Time is critical in emergency situations. The faster people realize something's wrong, the faster they can start searching. This simple habit, just telling someone where you're going, could be the difference between being found quickly and disappearing without a trace. Lesson number 1, research before you travel. This is the most important lesson of all. Before you book a cruise, before you get on a plane, before you go anywhere, do your research. Look into the safety record of the cruise line. Check if there have been reported disappearances or security issues. Read reviews from other passengers, not just the glowing 5-star reviews, but the critical ones, the ones that mention problems. Research the ports you'll be visiting. Understand the safety concerns in those areas. If you're booking through a travel agent, ask questions. What security measures does the cruise line have in place? How do they vet their crew members? What's their protocol if someone goes missing? Don't just assume that because a company is big and well-known, they have your safety as their top priority. Companies care about money. That's the reality. You have to care about your own safety. And the same goes for any travel. Hotels, resorts, tour groups, rental properties. Research the company, read reviews, look for red flags. Take the time to educate yourself before you go. Because once you're there, once you're in a dangerous situation, it might be too late. Knowledge is power. Information is protection. Use both to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. John's story is a miracle. Against all odds, he survived. He made it home. But not everyone is that lucky. Every year, people disappear from cruise ships and are never found. They're thrown overboard, trafficked, murdered, and their families are left with nothing but questions. Don't let that happen to you. Don't let that happen to someone you love. Take these lessons seriously. Trust your instincts. Stay aware of your surroundings. Never go anywhere alone with a stranger. Share your plans with someone you trust. And always, always do your research before you travel. These 5 things could save your life. I want to thank you for sticking with me through this story. I know it was long. I know it was difficult to hear at times. But these stories matter. These lessons matter. John's experience was horrific. But if sharing what he went through can help even one person avoid the same fate, then it's worth it. If you found this story valuable, if you learned something that could help keep you or your loved ones safe, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, because I'm going to keep bringing you true crime stories that teach important lessons. Stories that make you think. Stories that make you more aware and better prepared. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought of John's story. Tell me if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like something was wrong but didn't know what to do. Share this video, send it to your family and friends, especially anyone you know who's planning a cruise or a vacation. They need to hear this. They need to understand the risks and how to protect themselves. And if you want to support the work I do, researching these cases, putting together these stories, making sure people know the truth, consider becoming a member of this channel. Your support directly helps me continue creating content that could save lives. One more thing, if you or someone you know has been affected by human trafficking, there are resources available. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. You can call or text 24/7. They provide support, resources, and can connect you with local services. You are not alone. Help is available. John is still healing. He probably always will be, but he's alive. He's home. He's with his family. And every day he makes the choice to keep fighting, to keep living, because that's what survivors do. They survive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for taking these lessons to heart. Stay safe out there. And remember, no one should disappear without a trace. I'll see you in the next video.